They said I was overreacting, that it was just one day. But when your HOA tries to force you to host a complete stranger's wedding in your own backyard, without your consent, it stops being just a day. It becomes war. What happened to me is almost too wild to believe. But every word of it is true. From shady bylaw manipulation to hidden cameras and literal llamas at the reception, this is the story of how I took on the most controlling HOA you've ever heard of, and flipped the script. If you've ever dealt with power-hungry board members, nosy neighbors, or just love a good story of petty revenge served cold, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, drop a comment if you've had your own HOA horror story, subscribe for more insane tales like this, and share this video with someone who hates HOAs as much as you do. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. They say you never really know a place until you've lived there. Well, I thought I knew my neighborhood. Quiet, clean, tucked behind rows of manicured trees and pastel houses. It was the kind of community where everyone waved, even if they didn't mean it. But under that sunny suburban gloss was a storm waiting to explode. And at the eye of it all, my HOA. It started small, ridiculous fines for unsightly garbage cans, passive-aggressive newsletters about lawn height, and committee meetings that felt more like military briefings. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what they did next. They wanted me to host a wedding. Not my wedding, not a friend's wedding, a complete stranger's wedding, in my backyard, as if I was running some kind of free Airbnb chapel service. At first, I laughed. I thought it was a bad joke, some mix-up. But it wasn't. Apparently, according to some obscure clause buried in a 30-page bylaws document nobody actually reads, the HOA had the power to assign community responsibilities as deemed appropriate by the board in support of neighborhood unity. Their twisted interpretation? My house, with its big yard and convenient location, was now the designated venue for a couple I had never met in my life. The letter they sent was formal, almost smug. We appreciate your cooperation and enthusiasm in helping create a memorable community moment. Enthusiasm? The audacity! They even included a checklist, power outlets, seating capacity, preferred floral arrangements, as if I was just going to roll over and host the damn thing without a peep. But it wasn't just the request. It was the entitlement, the assumption that I would comply, that I wouldn't fight back, that they could steamroll me because, well, they always had. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about control, about boundaries, and about how far someone will go when they're backed into a corner. So, I decided, if they wanted a wedding, I'd give them one, just not the kind they expected. Let me rewind a bit, because to understand how we got to this outrageous wedding mandate, you need to understand the culture of my neighborhood, and more importantly, the petty tyrants running the HOA. When I first moved in, things seemed fine. The houses were charming, the lawns were symmetrical, and there was a faux sense of Stepford-like serenity, the kind of place where people judged you by your mailbox design. But the real rot set in the moment I attended my first HOA meeting. That's where I met Carol. Carol was the president of the HOA and the self-declared queen of the cul-de-sac. Hair teased to perfection, clipboard always in hand, and a smile that screamed, "I run this place." She wasn't elected because people loved her. She was elected because no one else wanted the job. And she made sure it stayed that way. The meetings weren't about solving problems. They were about asserting control. Carol and her minions would nitpick every detail. A garden gnome placed 2 inches from regulation. A teen's car parked too long in the driveway. or a Halloween decoration deemed excessively spooky. At first, I kept my head down. I thought if I played by the rules, they'd leave me alone. I mowed on Tuesdays, used regulation mulch, even attended their bizarre Yard of the Month luncheons. But compliance wasn't enough. It never is with people like that. Things really started to turn when I declined to join a committee. Carol approached me personally, told me how refreshing it would be to have someone like me help organize the community cookbook. I politely declined. Her smile faded just a bit. That's when the letters started. One for leaving a garden hose uncoiled, another for having wind chimes that may disturb neighbors, then a warning for hosting unregistered gatherings because a few friends came over for a football game. It was petty, relentless, and very clearly targeted. Then came the rumors. One neighbor told me Carol had mentioned I was resistant to community harmony. Another said she'd called me difficult. I had officially been labeled as a problem, just for existing outside her imaginary perfect narrative. And yet, I stayed civil. I followed the rules, even when they made no sense. But I could feel it building. Every letter, every meeting, every fake smile. Something bigger was coming. I could feel it in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. And then, the wedding notice arrived, dropped in my mailbox like a bomb wrapped in lace and cursive font, and everything I'd endured up to that point suddenly made sense. They weren't just trying to control the neighborhood. They were trying to control me. The day it happened started like any other. Coffee, morning news, and the faint buzz of sprinklers misting across the lawns. Then I saw it. A cream-colored envelope wedged perfectly in my mailbox. Heavy paper, gold trim, sealed with a wax stamp like it came straight from a royal court. The HOA logo was embossed at the top, and underneath, in elegant cursive, it read, Community Event Notification. Mandatory Host Property Designation. I remember laughing out loud. It sounded like the setup to a bad prank, but when I opened the letter, my stomach dropped. They had chosen my property, my home, as the official venue for an HOA-sponsored community wedding celebration. The letter explained that this was a unique opportunity to strengthen neighborhood bonds, and that participation was expected of all members in the spirit of unity. Expected. That word was doing a lot of heavy lifting. At first, I assumed it was some kind of mistake. I called the HOA office immediately, Carol answered. Of course, her tone so sugary it gave me cavities just hearing it. Oh yes, she chirped. We're thrilled to have your home host the event. It's just perfect. The couple is so excited. The couple? I asked. Who exactly are we talking about? James and Brooke, she said, as if I should know. They're new residents, moved in last month. We thought this would be such a warm welcome. A warm welcome for them, apparently. Not for the person being voluntold to turn their yard into a wedding venue. I told her I wasn't comfortable with it, that my property wasn't for public use, that I had plans that weekend. She gave this little laugh, the kind that drips with condescension, and said, well, technically, as part of the HOA covenant, all members agree to participate in community functions when selected by the board. I'm sure you wouldn't want to be the reason this special day falls apart. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was a power move. A week later, I got another letter, this one outlining responsibilities. I was expected to allow up to 50 guests, provide access to electricity, and make sure the grounds were tidy and photo-ready. They even listed decor themes and preferred guest parking zones. On my lawn, it was insane. I felt like I was living in a parody of suburban life. My friends didn't believe me until I showed them the letters. One of them even joked, "Man, you should charge admission." And honestly, That's when the first spark of rebellion lit inside me. Because if they wanted to use my home like a stage for their community fantasy, maybe it was time I gave them a show. Still, I tried to reason with them. I emailed, I called, I even showed up at a meeting, but every time, Carol shut me down with her same icy smile. "This is non-negotiable," she said at one point, tapping her papers like a judge delivering a verdict. That was the night I decided. If they were going to make me a character in their play, I was going to rewrite the script. And from that moment, I wasn't just defending my home, I was preparing for war. If I thought the wedding notice was the peak of absurdity, I was wrong. That was just the first crack in the dam. What followed was a flood of passive-aggressive power plays, legal threats dressed in fake courtesy, and a community performance so surreal it could have won an award for Most Unhinged HOA Drama of the Year. The week after the second letter, I received a packet, yes, an entire packet, from the HOA labeled Event Compliance Guidelines. It had color-coded diagrams, a timeline of the wedding day, an itemized list of my expected contributions, including refreshments and restroom access, and a list of potential fines for non-cooperation. Non-cooperation? Let's be clear. I never signed up for this wedding. I never RSVP'd. And yet, they were treating me like a rogue employee skipping mandatory training. I emailed Carol immediately. "This is beyond overreach," I wrote. "There is no clause that authorizes the forced use of private property for social events." Her reply: a smiley face emoji and a PDF titled Community Clause 14.7.3, Cooperative Event Mandate. That clause, buried in HOA legalese, was vague at best. It mentioned reasonable community obligations and the possibility of designated support roles, but nowhere did it say, "Yes, we can commandeer your backyard for a stranger's nuptials." But Carol? She saw what she wanted to see. Soon after, a small group of HOA volunteers began showing up at my property. Uninvited, one brought a measuring tape and started calculating the space between my hedges and the fence line. Another knocked to ask where the bride's dressing area would be. I told him I was dressing as a lawsuit. Then came the threat: a certified letter stating that failure to comply would result in escalating fines, starting at $500 a day. They cited willful obstruction of a board-approved event. I took that letter straight to my attorney. He was stunned. "This reads like they think they own your house," he said. "It's nonsense, but enforcing nonsense still costs time and money to fight." He advised documenting everything and not engaging unless necessary. And that's when I started noticing the surveillance. A small security camera appeared on the light post outside my house. When I confronted Carol, she claimed it was for community safety, due to increased tensions she caused, mind you. My mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes telling me to be a team player and stop being selfish. Someone even dumped wedding brochures on my front porch like it was an intervention. I was being boxed in, socially, legally, psychologically, and the worst part? Some of the neighbors were buying into it. People I'd known for years began treating me like the villain, like I was trying to ruin someone's special day. They didn't see the coercion, the bullying, the sheer lunacy of it all. They just saw Carol's polished narrative. And maybe that's what pushed me over the edge. Not the wedding, not even the fines, but the fact that I was being turned into the antagonist in my own story, cast as the bitter recluse, ruining love and community. So I flipped the script. I stopped arguing. I stopped replying to emails. I stopped attending meetings. On the surface, I became the cooperative host. I nodded. I signed the attendance sheet. I let them believe they'd won. But inside, I was planning something big, something that would remind everyone, especially Carol, that I wasn't the villain in this story. I was the twist ending they didn't see coming. There's a moment in every fight where something inside you just snaps. For me, it wasn't the letters or the cameras or even the fines. It was the moment I saw my home listed on a wedding website. Yes, my home. Someone had uploaded photos of my backyard, complete with a little blurb. A charming, rustic space nestled in the heart of our lovely neighborhood, perfect for an intimate ceremony. My patio was their aisle. My string lights, my own DIY project, were now part of someone else's fantasy. I felt violated, not just in a legal sense, but in a deeply personal way. My sanctuary had been turned into a prop. And that's when the real rage set in. I stopped sleeping. I'd lie awake imagining worst-case scenarios. Drunk guests wandering into my house, damage to my property, someone falling into the koi pond and suing me. I became consumed with this event, and yet I had to smile and wave as if I were totally fine with it. Even people I once got along with started avoiding me. One neighbor I used to dog walk with crossed the street when she saw me. Another said, "It's just one day. Can't you be happy for someone else for once?" Like I was the Grinch of suburbia. The isolation hurt more than I expected. I was being painted as the unreasonable one, the difficult one, the obstacle to happiness. But then something happened that changed everything. Late one night, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find an older man, tall, kind eyes, and holding a six-pack of beer. He introduced himself as Marvin, said he lived a few streets over. I'd seen him around, but never really talked. He said, "Heard what they're doing to you. It's wrong. Just wanted you to know not everyone's on their side." I invited him in. We talked for hours. Turns out, Marvin had his own battles with the HOA. They fined him for having a ramp installed for his wife, who was recovering from surgery. He fought them and won, but it cost him thousands. He said Carol's been running things unchecked for years, and most people are too afraid or too tired to stand up to her. That conversation sparked something in me. I wasn't alone. Over the next week, I quietly started reaching out, talking to other residents, asking questions, listening. I learned that more people were fed up than I ever realized. They just needed someone to push back first, someone to prove it could be done. That's when I knew I couldn't just stop the wedding. I had to make a statement, not just for me, but for everyone who felt steamrolled by this system. So I started planning. I documented every overreach, every violation of my rights, and every inconsistency in their demands. I worked with Marvin and a few others behind the scenes. We formed a loose coalition, neighbors who were ready to finally say, enough. And while the HOA thought I was defeated, compliant, and ready to host their dream wedding, I was laying the groundwork for something much, much bigger. Because when your home becomes a battlefield, your only options are to surrender or go nuclear. I chose the latter. If I was going to go down, I wasn't going quietly. I didn't just want to stop the wedding. I wanted to expose the HOA's overreach, dismantle their chokehold on the neighborhood, and reclaim my damn backyard. But it couldn't be messy. It had to be surgical, elegant, unforgettable. Step 1 was to dig deeper into the HOA bylaws. Really dig. I hired a lawyer friend who specialized in property law to go through every inch of that dusty rulebook. And wouldn't you know it? There was a little clause buried in the fine print about prior written consent for events that exceed 25 guests. The kicker? That consent had to come from the property owner. Boom. There it was. The HOA's entire operation was built on the assumption that I wouldn't push back legally, but I now had the ammo. Still, I didn't confront them yet. Step 2 was psychological. I played the role. I smiled in meetings. I answered their emails. I even agreed to a pre-wedding walkthrough with Brooke and James, the soon-to-be wed couple. They were nice enough, in a blissfully unaware kind of way. James looked around and said, "This is gonna be perfect, man. Thanks again for doing this." I just smiled and said, "Of course, happy to help." Inside, I was boiling. Then came step 3. Preparation. I started making a list of the most petty, legally permissible disruptions I could make. I wasn't going to ruin the wedding. I was going to host it exactly as requested, but with a twist. Think of it like a theatrical performance, one where I controlled the lighting, the sound, and the script. I bought a speaker system and queued up a playlist that included bagpipe solos, screeching goat remixes, and a 45-minute loop of "It's Raining Men." I even hired a guy from Craigslist to pretend to be a wildlife photographer, complete with binoculars and a camouflage tent in the middle of the backyard, "just studying the squirrels," he'd say. I also contacted a local llama rescue. Turns out, for a small fee, they'd let me borrow 2 llamas for educational purposes. I figured if I was going to host a rustic wedding, I might as well go full farm vibes. But the pièce de résistance? The official legal notice I had my lawyer draft. 2 days before the wedding, I sent it to the HOA. It included a formal cease and desist, citing the violation of the property consent clause, and stating that unless written proof of my voluntary approval was produced, the HOA would be held liable for trespassing, property damage, and coercion. Oh, and I CC'd every resident in the neighborhood. That bombshell triggered a frenzy. Carol called me immediately, furious. "This is sabotage!" she shrieked. "No," I said calmly. "This is me finally reading the rules you love to enforce." She tried threatening more fines. I told her any further action would be met with a public lawsuit, and reminded her that court records are public too. She hung up on me. But I wasn't done. I printed out flyers titled "Know Your Rights as a Homeowner," with the bylaw excerpts, and Marvin and I distributed them that same evening. The reaction was explosive. Suddenly, neighbors were buzzing. People started questioning past fines, calling emergency meetings, and realizing just how much control they'd blindly handed over. By the morning of the wedding, Carol was in damage control mode. And me? I was sipping coffee on my porch, watching the chaos unfold, knowing the final act hadn't even begun. October 3rd, the day of the wedding. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm breeze, and a forecast that couldn't have been more ironic. Calm, with a 100% chance of chaos. I woke up early, not out of excitement, but because my nerves were vibrating. Everything I'd been planning was about to come together. By 9 a.m., the setup crew started arriving. Carol wasn't among them, but her fingerprints were all over everything. White folding chairs, pink floral centerpieces, a massive archway I definitely didn't approve, and some poor soul trying to untangle 300 feet of string lights I'd already disabled at the breaker box. I greeted them all with a smile. "Need help with anything?" I asked sweetly. They declined, assuming I was being compliant. I was just soaking it in, taking mental pictures of every single misstep, every unpermitted stake driven into my lawn, every power cord trailing through my garden beds. And then came the guests. Around 1 p.m., people started arriving, well-dressed, clueless, and in awe of the venue. My backyard did look nice, to be fair. But they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Every chair was zip-tied slightly off-center. The arch was positioned to perfectly block the sun. So it blinded the officiant and the llamas. They were already in place, lounging like divas behind the buffet table. By 2 p.m., Brooke and James arrived, all smiles. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. They'd been used just like I had. Pawns in Carol's suburban scheme. Brooke came up to me, beaming. "This is beyond anything I imagined," she said. "Thank you for everything." I nodded. "Glad it's memorable." Then came the final piece. The music. Right as the ceremony began, I hit play on my special playlist from inside the house. At first, soft harp music. Then, goats, screeching goats, followed by a mariachi band cover of Wrecking Ball. I could hear the confusion ripple across the yard. Someone went running toward the house to ask me to turn it off. Too bad I'd locked all the doors. I walked outside, holding a copy of the cease and desist letter, and handed it directly to the officiant. "Sorry," I said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This event is in violation of HOA Bylaw 14-723. As the property owner, I never gave consent. You're all technically trespassing." Gasps. Someone dropped their mimosa. Carol appeared out of nowhere, her face already red. "This is your fault. You ruined this." I smiled. "No, Carol. You did. I just followed the rules." Brooke burst into tears. James tried to calm her down. Guests were whispering, taking out their phones, recording everything. And then came Marvin, who stepped up beside me and handed Carol a petition, signed by over 40 residents, calling for a vote to remove her from the HOA board. It was carnage, beautiful, justified carnage. The wedding, unsurprisingly, was called off. Guests left in confusion. Brooke's mother accused me of being a monster. I just handed her a flyer titled, "Know Your Rights as a Homeowner." As the sun started to set, the backyard was littered with half-eaten cake, tipped-over chairs, and a pair of very smug llamas chewing on Carol's floral arrangements. It was glorious. And I went inside, made a drink, and toasted to finally taking back control. The days following the disaster wedding were something out of a Netflix true crime documentary. Minus the body count, but just as dramatic. The morning after, I woke up to a front yard littered with empty champagne flutes, flower petals, and one of the llamas still hanging around like it owned the place. But that was nothing compared to what blew up online. Turns out, several guests had posted videos of the chaos. One TikTok hit 2 million views in 24 hours. Bride gets ambushed at backyard wedding by actual homeowner. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just dealing with angry residents. They were dealing with a PR nightmare. Carol called an emergency meeting that evening. Of course, I went. The community center was packed. Standing room only. You could feel the shift in energy. For years, Carol had controlled the room like a teacher scolding a class. But now, she looked rattled, sweaty, like someone who'd just realized the peasants had found the pitchforks. She opened with a speech about misunderstandings and regrettable incidents. But the moment she finished, Marvin stood up and read the petition out loud. "We, the undersigned, hereby demand a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership due to abuse of power, failure to follow bylaws, and gross mishandling of community relations." Applause. Carol tried to argue that the petition wasn't valid, that proper procedures hadn't been followed. But this time, the community pushed back. People shouted. One guy actually stood up and said, "You tried to turn his house into a wedding venue. What else have you been hiding?" Turns out, plenty. Over the next week, more stories came out. Misappropriated funds, favoritism in contract approvals, even fake violations issued to residents Carol didn't like. My stunt had pulled the curtain back, and now the whole board was under fire. Within 2 weeks, Carol and 2 other board members resigned. A special election was called, and you better believe Marvin ran and won. As for Brooke and James, they moved out a month later, I don't know if the wedding ever happened, but word is they eloped in Vegas. Probably a smart choice. But the best part? The new HOA leadership instituted reforms, clearer rules, transparent voting, a clause explicitly preventing the forced use of private property for events. They even reimbursed me for the damages and issued a formal apology, signed by the entire board. I kept the apology letter, framed it, actually, hung it in the hallway right next to the thermostat. Every time I pass it, I smile. Not because I won. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about setting a boundary and watching an entire community wake up to just how far things had gone. And honestly, that was more satisfying than any playlist of screeching goats could ever be. Looking back, it's almost surreal how far things went. A wedding in my backyard, fines, surveillance, llamas. But this story, as wild as it sounds, was never just about the wedding. That was the spark. But the fire had been smoldering for a long time. What it really came down to was control. Not just the HOA's need to exert it, but our collective willingness to surrender it. I didn't fight back because I enjoy drama or conflict. I fought back because I realized something important. When good people stay quiet, power consolidates. And in the hands of the wrong people, that power turns into something oppressive, even in a place as seemingly harmless as a suburban neighborhood. I've lived here for years. I know these streets, these houses, these people. We mow our lawns on Saturdays, wave politely, host BBQs in the summer. But somewhere along the way, fear crept in. Fear of speaking up, of rocking the boat, of being labeled difficult. And that fear? It gave people like Carol a kingdom to rule. But the moment I stood my ground, truly stood it, others did too. Marvin, the neighbors who signed the petition, even the silent ones who nodded when I passed them on the street, offering a subtle thumbs up. That's the real power of resistance. It's contagious. Now, our HOA meetings feel different. Less like trials, more like conversations. The board answers questions. Votes actually matter. And people aren't afraid to ask why. It's not perfect, and probably never will be, but it's better. And that's something worth fighting for. If you're dealing with something similar, whether it's an HOA, a toxic workplace, or just a person who constantly oversteps, here's what I'll say. Boundaries matter. Your peace matters. And sometimes the only way to protect both is to make a little noise. Especially when someone tries to throw a wedding in your backyard without asking. So yeah, that's the story of how I went from a quiet homeowner to the unintentional star of the weirdest wedding that never was. If you enjoyed this roller coaster, and you're into more real-life stories of chaos, justice, and the occasional rogue llama, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Trust me, this neighborhood? It's far from boring. Thanks for watching. Stay bold, stay smart, and don't let anyone put a wedding in your backyard.